Hello everybody, last year I acquired a beautiful 1988 Porsche 944 Turbo S, an absolutely wonderful car and one I'd actually been looking for quite some time. They are really, truly brilliant. They're a very usable classic. They're fast enough that you can have fun, but not so fast that you can't have fun for very long. They're also large and roomy enough that they're actually quite practical to use day to day. However, they're not so physically big on the outside that you can't really enjoy them on the kind of narrow country roads where I live. Unfortunately, the particular car that I had, I actually won in a competition being run by Classic Giveaways. Now, I know you might be thinking, that doesn't really sound very unfortunate at all. And at the time, it actually felt like something really quite nice because, not that I talk about it very much on the channel, behind the scenes, a few things were happening in my personal life and with my family that really weren't very nice at all. So this was a really very welcome piece of quite good news. Unfortunately, the internet being what it is, a few people didn't seem to think it was possible that I could actually have some good luck and were totally convinced that something really nefarious had happened because Classic Giveaways, although it's run by a chap called Sam, Tom, TGE, is also heavily involved with it. And so, because we're two YouTubers, despite the fact we've actually never had any business connection whatsoever, a lot of people thought there was some sort of grand scheme at play. It's not something I want to dwell on particularly much because what happened at the time led to some fairly unpleasant things for me, to be honest with you. My mental health took quite a knock because I had a plethora of comments, not just on the videos, but also a lot of really quite unsavoury messages sent to my DMs as well. And that, as you might imagine, really did take the shine off that car. That is why there was a lot of content initially, and then the car simply vanished from view, because to be honest with you, every time I looked at it, it didn't make me feel all that good. First world problems, I know, not something I really hold anybody particularly responsible for. It's something I should have really thought about a little bit more, and there wasn't, sadly, anything I could really do about it to convince people of the, legitimacy of what had happened and all that jazz, and it really was just all round unfortunate. I know, and if you're watching this, I should probably apologise because you're almost certainly not one of those people, and a huge amount of you were really supportive of what had happened as well, and for those I felt particularly bad because I know there was a lot of content that I promised that I am now not going to be able to deliver. The 944 was not a car that I was ever going to probably keep long term. However, it was a kind of car that I really did enjoy. So, towards the end of last year, I managed to rehome the 944 with a lovely chap called Jason, who doesn't actually watch YouTube, but he does have an Instagram page. So if you want to follow what's happening with the 944, I'll put the link up to his Instagram page now, and you can follow that. However, I really enjoyed the classic Porsche thing. I know many of you really enjoyed the classic Porsche thing. So before the 944 had actually gone, I wanted to make sure that there was going to be something on the channel to sort of take its spiritual place. Although this is not the direct replacement for it, I actually took a really interesting car from Jason as a part exchange. So I didn't get too much money back from the 944, but that's fine. And Jason is a real Porsche guy. I wanted to make sure that it went to somebody who was going to really look after it, appreciate it, and love it. And he is certainly doing that. So if you want to follow the 944's journey, please go and check out his Instagram page. And if you want to see what I have replaced it with and what's going to be providing Porsche content on the channel for a little while, stick around because I want to introduce you to this. This is a 1992 Porsche 968, easily one of the oddest cars to ever come from the company and the final step in Porsche's Transaxle journey that had begun in 1976 with the 924. It's quite incredible really because that car and its successors provided the backbone of Porsche's sales for 2 decades, and yet they were never even designed to be a Porsche in the first place. It's well known that the original 924 was in fact built as a VW. 2 years later, the 924 was joined by the much more advanced and upmarket 928. That was powered by an all-new Porsche-designed V8 engine and intended to usurp the 911 as Porsche's flagship car. Although it was priced as such, I think it's fair to say that the 928 never really achieved the recognition that Porsche hoped it would, and instead the 911 seemed to continue on evergreen and with Porsche fans all around the world never falling out of love. In 1982, the 944 was introduced, designed to plug the gap between the entry-level 924 and the 911. It was a runaway success and rivaled 911 sales for the best part of a decade, becoming in many ways the symbol of the yuppie movement and 1980s excess. However, come the 1990s and Porsche had a problem, a big one. They were nearly broke, and their model lineup comprised of almost entirely cars that were now 2 decades old. Porsche knew that big change was going to be required if they were to stay in business. However, the reality was, at that time, they simply didn't have the money to do what it was that they needed. Instead, they did the next best thing. They slimmed down the model range and developed the cars which were still popular. In the case of the 924, nearly all of the range bar the S2 was dropped, and work began on the S3. However, as that project progressed, they realised that so many changes were being made, they probably could get away with giving it a whole new model designation, and the 968 was born. Unfortunately, it was clear to everybody that the 968 was very much a stopgap solution, and so it had one of the shortest production lives of any Porsche car, just 3 years, taking it from 1992 until 1995 when it was canned alongside the 928, ending 2 decades of front-engined Porsche sports cars, an era we are almost certain to never see return. A couple of years later, the Boxster was introduced, and the rest, as they say, is history. Although the side profile is very much the same as a 944, there are a number of visual changes made to the car which make them fairly easy to spot. So at the front you've now got 928 style headlamps, but they sit a little bit higher than in the V8, and they're in these lovely little arches here that give the front end a little bit more of a curviness than the outgoing 944. The bumper also has a new, smoother look that's very much like the 993 that came almost immediately afterwards. It's from here that the car looks most familiar. The only real changes are in detail to the wheels and a few other small areas too. At the back you've now got a new bridge spoiler, which I think is much nicer than the old soft squishy rubberized thing, and what they call the soap bar lights. Those, I think, again a big improvement over the fairly dated looking items you found on the 944. And the indented Porsche script on the back, I think, is a really nice touch too. Overall, this does look to me like a much more modern car than the 944, although I appreciate there are things good and bad about both. The interior is certainly a case of subtle evolution, and it will be very familiar to anyone that's been in a facelift 944. The dash is more or less unchanged. The seats are also basically the same as the ones in my 944, but here they're covered in this beautiful, very soft grey leather with blue piping, which I initially wasn't too keen on, but now I'm really rather attached to. The rest of it is pretty much unchanged though. The significant addition in here is a 6-speed manual gearbox as an option alongside Porsche's now Tiptronic branded automatic. That gearbox is connected to a 4-cylinder 3-litre engine, which is also an evolution of the unit in the 944. The biggest alteration here is the introduction of Porsche's then all-new VarioCam variable valve timing system, and that's one of the reasons that this now puts out 240 horsepower over the outgoing S2's 210. It is still a little bit down on the old 944 Turbo, which in later form and S trim had 250 horsepower and was a little bit quicker. They did make a handful of 968 Turbo models branded the 968 Turbo S, but they were more a product of Porsche's motorsport division and were then, and now, extremely rare, with I believe only about 16 examples actually being made. In spite of favourable reviews, the 968 really struggled to find buyers. In a production run that was a third as long as the 944, they sold only a tenth as many cars. One of the most commonly cited reasons for that is the price of it. In 1992, the list price of one of these was £35,000, the same as a very nicely specified Range Rover or a Jaguar XJ6. But the issue wasn't Porsche overcharging for their cars. In fact, it was quite the opposite. They simply couldn't make them at a price that people were willing to pay. This was why they weren't making any money. All of their cars were costing them far too much to build, and this was something they eventually got Toyota in to help them solve. In the interim though, this was still a very large problem. On the topic of production, the 968 also holds the distinction of being the only front-engined 4-cylinder Porsche to be built in Zuffenhausen, with the previous 2 generations being assembled over at Neckarsulm. So, what was it that Porsche could do to try and make this car more appealing? They introduced the 968 Club Sport. To build one of those, you simply take one of these, strip out many of the luxuries, the newer, nicer door cards, the fancy seats, even things like the electric release for the boot. You then give it stiffer, lower springs, make it slightly sporty, give it some funky colour options, and they reduced the price quite significantly too, because when the Club Sport arrived, instead of £35,000, it cost £28,000. And all of a sudden, people were interested in the 968. There was even a UK specific model of the 968 called the 968 Sport, and that was inspired by the fact that many people here were ordering the Club Sport because of its cheaper list price, but then optioning back in some of the luxury extras like comfier seats. So Porsche Cars of Great Britain ordered a batch of cars that were technically speaking Club Sports, but with some extras added back in, meaning they're a bit of a halfway thing between this car and a Club Sport. The reason I bought this is twofold. First off, the regular 968 is considerably more luxurious, better equipped and more comfortable than a Club Sport. The Club Sport handles brilliantly, but as a daily driver on the kind of roads I live, I think it's just a little bit too much. And because the 968 Club Sport is now the most desirable variant of the 968, despite it costing significantly less when new, it now costs a heck of a lot more. So I picked this car up for less than £17,000, whereas to get into a Club Sport that initially cost about £8,000 less, I'd probably have to pay that amount more. So it just didn't make any sense to me. This particular car also has an amazing history. It was one of the first 968s in the country, being registered on the 1st of August 1992. And it was owned by AFN Reading, then the name for Porsche Reading, and used as apparently a management car and also a demonstrator to show what the 968 was all about. It was specified in this beautiful shade of cobalt blue, and the options are headlight washers, sunroof, the sports seats, the grey interior and the blue piping, the painted bridge spoiler at the back, which does make a really big difference, and unfortunately these side strips here as well, which they called side protection mouldings. Those need to go because they really date the look of this car. I am also told that this car was on the stand for the 1992 British Motor Show. However, despite my best efforts, I haven't managed to find any pictorial proof of that fact. So if somebody was at that show and you happen to take some pictures of the Porsche stand, I would love to know if this car was there. If you do have a photo, please do send it over. I did watch the Top Gear episode from that year about the motor show, but Porsche actually barely featured. In fact, when I wanted to do some more research on this car and I bought some magazines from the time, it was very, very clear that Porsche was not the powerhouse it is today. In fact, for said 1992 motor show, in Autocar magazine, they gave Porsche only the tiniest amount of column inches. They barely feature at all. The car is currently on 144,000 miles. I am, I believe, the 6th owner, and it came with an enormous stack of paperwork proving that it really has been cared for quite some time. In fact, Naresh, who I got it from, I cannot say enough nice things about. He was the perfect car seller, and anyone who's tried to buy a car ever will know that that's a very rare thing. Without even prompting him, when I went to go and see the car, he'd made sure to leave it absolutely stone cold so that I could check everything was okay, and even invited me to come into his garage where the car was stored and look under it with a torch to check for corrosion. That's exactly the sort of person you always want to buy a car from. So Naresh, thank you very much. So, plans for the car. That's a tricky one, and I'm still trying to work that out. If you've any particularly bright ideas, please do head into the comment section down below and tell me. Initially, I thought about doing some pretty serious modification to this car and turning it into the sort of 968S that Porsche never built. I even thought about maybe trying to fit a 6-cylinder engine in here, the sort of thing everyone really expected it to have for the money. However, this is such a clean, tidy and original example. Doing something that extreme would kind of seem like sacrilege, and I've already got a few other modification projects ongoing, like the S2000. So I will do things to this car, but I think the nature of the modifications I'm going to try and make more sympathetic and OEM plus rather than anything quite dramatic. The first order of business was to take the car to a specialist, get it checked over and make sure there wasn't any service items outstanding. So it went down to Pi Performance in Lavenham, who were great and managed to get the car in at the absolute last minute. Because one thing I did notice on the drive home was a small rattle. I'd hoped it was something insignificant, and that's exactly what it turned out to be. It was simply a heat shield that had worked its way loose, and so we replaced that, and it didn't cost all that much. When we went through the service history, we found that everything was up to date, and after they'd been through the car, they said that it was all exactly as described. The only thing they would really recommend doing was the chain in it, because that was due a service, and the chain tensioner also is known to fail, so they wanted to look at that. They can service that, which they did. They also replaced some of the chain guides. I spent about £1,200 to £1,300 with them, and that means the car is now completely and totally up to date. It requires, at the moment, nothing. The only problem I had with it was one of the headlights did not want to sit down when you kind of got it up, and they sorted that as well. That was about an hour's labour to fix that. I think one of the pieces behind it had cracked and got in the way. So that's all sorted and done. I've actually done quite a few miles with it already. In fact, it's an excellent Grand Tourer. Not only is it very comfortable, but it has a fuel tank that's over 70 litres, and combined with a calculated real-world 34 mpg on the motorway, that means I got almost 500 miles between fill-ups. And had I been desperate, I think you really can get over 500 miles to a tank in one of these, which is spectacular. The next things on my list are the brakes, which are not very good, the tyres, which are okay, but just a bit too old for my liking, and the wheels. I happen to think that if we remove this side moulding strip, put slightly larger alloys on it, this will look a lot more modern. I still want it to retain, of course, that overall classic feel, and I think it'd be more or less impossible to lose it. But there are a few things I think you can do to make this car look even better. Beyond that, though, I am all ears, and I would love your suggestions for what it is that I can do with this car. I actually had it now for about 2 or 3 months. It's been a long time coming, and I apologise that it's taken quite as long as it has to tell you all about it. But now it's here, now you know about it, and I'm so happy for that. Tell me, have I made a terrible mistake, or do you agree that this is a somewhat underrated Porsche classic car bargain? Thanks for watching. Please like, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.